Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of person who followed rules. As a former air traffic controller at Denver International Airport, he understood the importance of protocol, precision, and above all, trust. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in what people now called the before times. Marcus was reviewing flight patterns when the first reports came in about strange incidents at hospitals across the city. By noon, the news was calling it a widespread outbreak of an unknown pathogen. By evening, Marcus watched from the control tower as his carefully orchestrated airspace descended into chaos. The infection spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Within 72 hours, Denver International had transformed from one of the busiest airports in America to a ghost town filled with the shambling remains of travelers, workers, and crew members who had been caught in the initial wave. Marcus had barricaded himself in the control tower with 3 other survivors: Elena Rodriguez, a former TSA supervisor, David Kim, a maintenance engineer, and Rebecca Walsh, a pilot who had been grounded when her flight crew succumbed to the infection. What made their situation particularly desperate wasn't just the infected wandering the terminals below. It was the realization that the automated systems Marcus had spent years perfecting were now working against them. The airport's sophisticated security protocols, designed to prevent unauthorized access, had effectively trapped them inside their own fortress. The electronic locks, the reinforced doors, the backup power systems that Marcus had once considered marvels of modern engineering had become their prison. Marcus discovered the cruel irony of their situation when he tried to access the emergency protocols. The airport's board of directors, led by Chairman Robert Sterling, had implemented a new security system just months before the outbreak. This system, sold to them by Sterling's brother-in-law's tech company, was supposed to be unhackable and foolproof. It required biometric scans from at least 3 board members to override in emergency situations. Unfortunately, those board members were now either dead or among the infected hordes below. The group's first week was spent in denial, believing that rescue would come, that the military would restore order, that someone in authority would fix the situation. Marcus spent hours trying to reach other airports, other control towers, anyone who might have maintained communication capabilities. The responses he received painted a grim picture of a world where the infrastructure he had dedicated his career to protecting had become a liability. Elena discovered the truth about their predicament when she accessed the airport's personnel files. Sterling had not only implemented the restrictive security system but had also cut funding for emergency supplies and backup communication equipment. The money that should have gone to disaster preparedness had instead been diverted to what the financial records described as administrative bonuses and consultant fees. Marcus realized that Sterling had essentially profited from making the airport less safe while selling the board on the illusion of enhanced security. David's engineering expertise revealed another layer of the betrayal. The backup generators that should have provided power for months had been installed with substandard parts. The water filtration system that should have sustained them indefinitely had been connected to pipes that were already showing signs of corrosion. The food storage areas that should have been stocked with emergency rations contained barely enough supplies for a few weeks. Every corner that could be cut for profit had been cut, leaving them vulnerable in the exact situation the airport's emergency protocols were supposed to address. Rebecca's pilot training allowed her to understand the broader implications of their situation. The flight data she could access showed that similar airports across the country had experienced the same systematic failures. The infected outbreak had simply exposed the rot that had been building in the infrastructure for years. Corporate greed had hollowed out the very systems designed to protect people in crisis situations. As their supplies dwindled and the infected began to find ways into areas that should have been secure, Marcus realized that waiting for rescue was no longer an option. The same administrative corruption that had trapped them had likely compromised rescue efforts across the region. If they wanted to survive, they would need to take control of their situation and find a way to escape the fortress that had become their tomb. The control tower's windows provided a clear view of the airfield, where several aircraft sat abandoned but potentially functional. Marcus began to formulate a plan that would require them to venture into the infected zones below, but first, they needed to understand exactly what they were fighting against, both the infected and the system that had failed them so completely. Marcus spent the next several days studying the airport's layout with the intensity of someone planning a military operation. The control tower's elevation provided a strategic advantage for observation, but it also made them visible to any infected that retained enough cognitive function to look up. Through the reinforced windows, he could see the aircraft on the tarmac, including a Boeing 737 that Rebecca believed might still be airworthy. The challenge was getting there alive. Elena had been conducting her own investigation into the airport's security failures. Her TSA background gave her access to incident reports and security footage that painted a disturbing picture of the outbreak's early hours. The security cameras showed that the initial infected had gained access to restricted areas through doors that should have been locked, elevators that should have required authorization, and corridors that should have been monitored. The automated systems that Sterling's company had installed were either malfunctioning or had been deliberately compromised. The footage revealed something even more troubling. In the hours before the outbreak became public knowledge, Sterling himself had been at the airport, along with several other board members. They had accessed the secure areas using their administrative credentials, but instead of implementing emergency protocols, they appeared to be gathering personal belongings and sensitive documents. The timestamp on the footage showed that Sterling had left the airport at least 6 hours before the first official reports of the infection reached the control tower. David's technical analysis of the building systems revealed the extent of the sabotage. The air filtration system had been set to recirculate air from the infected areas into the supposedly secure zones. The elevator systems had been programmed to remain active even when emergency lockdown procedures should have disabled them. Most damning of all, the communication systems that should have allowed coordination with emergency responders had been configured to route through servers that were easily compromised or disabled. Rebecca discovered that the fuel systems for the aircraft had been deliberately drained or contaminated. The Boeing 737 that appeared to be their best hope for escape had been refueled with a mixture that included water and other contaminants. Someone had wanted to ensure that anyone trying to use the aircraft for evacuation would fail catastrophically. The pattern was too systematic to be coincidental. Someone had planned for this scenario and had taken steps to prevent exactly the kind of escape the group was contemplating. Marcus began to piece together a timeline that revealed the true scope of the betrayal. Sterling and his associates had received advance warning about the outbreak, possibly days or even weeks before it became public. Instead of using that information to strengthen the airport's defenses or coordinate with emergency services, they had used it to position themselves for profit and to eliminate potential witnesses to their corruption. The infected outbreak had provided perfect cover for what amounted to a carefully orchestrated corporate murder. The group's situation became more desperate when they realized that their communications with the outside world had been monitored and potentially manipulated. The emergency frequencies that Marcus had been using to contact other survivors were being jammed or redirected. The GPS systems that should have helped rescue teams locate them were broadcasting false coordinates. Even their attempts to signal for help using the airport's emergency beacons were being suppressed by the same systems that were supposed to amplify them. Elena's security expertise helped them understand that they were not just trapped by the infected or by mechanical failures. They were being actively hunted by a system that had been designed to eliminate them. The airport's automated defenses, which should have been protecting them, had been reprogrammed to treat them as threats. Motion sensors that should have detected infected intruders were instead tracking the survivors' movements and reporting their locations to unknown recipients. David discovered that the airport's computer systems were still connected to external networks, despite the apparent collapse of civilization outside. Someone was remotely monitoring their activities, accessing their communications, and potentially controlling the building systems to make their situation more difficult. The same technology that had once made the airport efficient and secure was now being used to orchestrate their elimination. Rebecca's analysis of the flight data revealed that similar situations were occurring at airports across the country. The pattern of system failures, the timing of the outbreaks, and the specific ways that escape routes had been compromised suggested a coordinated effort that went far beyond simple corporate negligence. The infected outbreak was not just a natural disaster, it was being used as cover for a systematic elimination of witnesses and potential whistleblowers. Marcus realized that their survival depended not just on escaping the airport, but on exposing the conspiracy that had trapped them there. The evidence they had gathered could prove that the outbreak's impact had been deliberately magnified by corrupt officials who had prioritized profit over public safety. If they could get that evidence to the right people, they might be able to prevent similar tragedies at other locations. The third week of their imprisonment brought a new development that changed everything. Marcus was monitoring the emergency frequencies when he intercepted a transmission that chilled him to the bone. It was Sterling's voice, clear and unmistakable, coordinating with unknown parties about cleanup operations at various airports. The conversation revealed that Sterling was not only alive but was actively directing efforts to eliminate survivors who might possess evidence of the conspiracy. Elena had been working on bypassing the security systems when she made a discovery that explained how Sterling's people were able to monitor their activities. Hidden cameras and microphones had been installed throughout the control tower during the recent security upgrade. These devices were not part of the official security system but were instead part of a parallel surveillance network that reported directly to Sterling's private servers. The group realized they had been performing for an audience that was using their own words and actions against them. David's investigation into the building's mechanical systems revealed that their captors had been using the airport's infrastructure to gradually weaken their position. The water supply had been contaminated with mild toxins that would slowly debilitate them without causing immediate death. The air circulation system had been adjusted to reduce oxygen levels in the control tower, making them less alert and more prone to mistakes. Even the temperature controls had been manipulated to create stress and discomfort that would affect their decision-making abilities. Rebecca discovered that the aircraft she had been examining were not just randomly damaged but had been systematically sabotaged to prevent exactly the kind of escape they were planning. The fuel contamination was just the beginning. Critical flight systems had been disabled, communication equipment had been removed, and navigation systems had been reprogrammed with false data. Someone had anticipated their escape plan and had taken steps to ensure it would fail. Marcus realized that they were not just fighting for survival against the infected but were engaged in a psychological warfare campaign against opponents who had every advantage. Sterling's people had resources, technology, and most importantly, time to plan their moves. The survivors were reacting to situations that had been carefully orchestrated to force them into making predictable choices that would lead to their elimination. The group's situation became even more desperate when they discovered that Sterling's people were using the infected as a weapon against them. The automated systems that controlled the airport's doors and elevators were being used to direct infected individuals toward the control tower. The same technology that had once managed passenger flow was now being used to orchestrate attacks by creatures that retained just enough intelligence to follow simple commands. Elena's security background helped her understand that they were facing an opponent who was using their own training and expertise against them. Sterling's people knew how security personnel would react to threats, how engineers would attempt to solve technical problems, and how pilots would try to escape using aircraft. Every predictable response had been anticipated and countered in advance. David realized that the building systems they were trying to manipulate were actively fighting back against their efforts. The computerized controls that managed everything from lighting to life support were being remotely adjusted to counteract their attempts at repairs or modifications. They were essentially trying to fix a machine that was designed to break down in specific ways at specific times. Rebecca's analysis of the flight data from other airports revealed that Sterling's conspiracy was not limited to Denver. Similar patterns of system failures and survivor elimination were occurring at major airports across the country. The scope of the conspiracy suggested that it had been planned for years and involved participants at the highest levels of government and industry. Marcus understood that their situation was not just about survival but about justice. Sterling and his associates had not only betrayed their responsibilities to public safety but had actively participated in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. The evidence they had gathered could potentially expose a conspiracy that had used a natural disaster as cover for mass murder and corporate profiteering. The group made a decision that would define their chances of survival. Instead of continuing to react to Sterling's moves, they would take the initiative and force him to react to theirs. They would use their knowledge of the airport's systems against their captors, turn the surveillance network into a weapon, and find a way to expose the conspiracy even if it meant sacrificing their own lives in the process. Marcus developed a plan that required them to split up for the first time since the outbreak began. The control tower's communication equipment could be modified to broadcast their evidence to emergency frequencies across the region, but the process would require someone to manually maintain the broadcast while others created diversions to prevent Sterling's people from jamming the signal. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance to ensure that the truth would survive even if they did not. Elena volunteered to handle the most dangerous part of the operation. Her security training had taught her how to move through the airport's service corridors without triggering motion sensors or security cameras. She would need to reach the main server room and physically damage the equipment that Sterling's people were using to monitor and control the airport's systems. The server room was located in the basement, in an area that was heavily infested with infected, but it was the only way to blind their opponents long enough to complete the broadcast. David would remain in the control tower to modify the broadcasting equipment and maintain the signal once Marcus began transmitting their evidence. His engineering expertise was essential for bypassing the safeguards that prevented unauthorized broadcasts, but he would also be the most vulnerable to retaliation once Sterling's people realized what was happening. The control tower's elevation made it an obvious target, and David would have no way to escape if Sterling's people decided to attack directly. Rebecca would attempt to reach the aircraft maintenance facility to prepare one of the smaller planes for a potential escape. The facility was located on the opposite side of the airport from the control tower, which would force Sterling's people to divide their attention between multiple targets. Rebecca's pilot training would be essential for quickly assessing which aircraft might be functional and for planning an escape route that would avoid the areas where Sterling's people were likely to be monitoring. Marcus would coordinate the operation from the control tower while preparing the evidence for broadcast. His knowledge of air traffic control systems would be crucial for reaching the right frequencies and ensuring that their message would be received by people who could act on the information. He would also need to maintain communication with the other team members and make real-time decisions about when to proceed with each phase of the plan. The group spent 2 days preparing for the operation, using the airport's public address system to create false communications that would mislead Sterling's surveillance network about their actual intentions. They discussed fictional escape plans through areas they had no intention of visiting and made requests for supplies they did not actually need. The goal was to create enough confusion to make their real plan less predictable. Elena began her descent into the airport's lower levels at dawn, when the infected were typically less active. The service corridors were narrow and poorly lit, but they provided cover from the surveillance cameras that monitored the main areas. She carried tools that would allow her to disable the server equipment without triggering immediate alarms, but she knew that Sterling's people would realize what was happening within minutes of the systems going offline. David started modifying the broadcasting equipment as soon as Elena confirmed that she had reached the first checkpoint. The modifications required him to bypass multiple safety systems and override protocols that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized broadcast they were attempting. The process was technically complex and would take at least an hour to complete, assuming that Sterling's people did not interfere with the control tower's power supply. Rebecca began her journey toward the aircraft maintenance facility using a route that took her through areas of the airport that had been abandoned since the outbreak began. The infected in these areas were often trapped by debris or security barriers, but they were also less predictable than the ones in the main terminals. Rebecca carried flares and other distraction devices that would allow her to create noise and light in areas far from her actual location. Marcus began preparing the evidence for broadcast, organizing the security footage, financial records, and communication intercepts into a format that would be clear and convincing to anyone who received the transmission. The evidence was damning, but it needed to be presented in a way that would motivate immediate action from law enforcement or military personnel who might still be operating in the region. The operation began to unfold with the precision of a military campaign, but Marcus knew that their success would depend on factors they could not control. Sterling's people had demonstrated their ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and they had resources that the survivors could not match. The next few hours would determine whether justice would be served or whether the conspiracy would succeed in eliminating its final witnesses. Elena's descent into the server room revealed the true extent of Sterling's surveillance network. The basement level contained equipment that was far more sophisticated than anything that should have been in a civilian airport. Military-grade communication systems, advanced data processing servers, and surveillance equipment that belonged in intelligence facilities rather than transportation hubs. The discovery confirmed Marcus's suspicions that Sterling's conspiracy involved participants from government agencies and defense contractors. The server room was guarded by automated security systems that had been designed to eliminate intruders without human intervention. Elena's training allowed her to recognize the weapon systems and electronic countermeasures, but disabling them would require more time than she had anticipated. The infected that wandered the basement corridors were being directed by these same systems, creating a coordinated defense that was far more dangerous than random encounters with individual creatures. David's modifications to the broadcasting equipment were proceeding ahead of schedule, but he discovered that Sterling's people were already attempting to counter his efforts. The control tower's internet connection was being flooded with data that was designed to overload the system and prevent outgoing communications. The power supply was being manipulated to create fluctuations that could damage sensitive equipment. David realized that their opponents were monitoring his work in real time and were taking active steps to sabotage the broadcast. Rebecca reached the aircraft maintenance facility to find that Sterling's people had been using it as a base of operations. The facility contained equipment and supplies that confirmed the conspiracy's scope and resources. Communication equipment that could coordinate activities across multiple states, weapons and vehicles that suggested military or paramilitary involvement, and documents that revealed the names and locations of other participants in the conspiracy. Marcus monitored the operation from the control tower while maintaining communication with emergency responders who were still operating in the region. His broadcasts were being jammed or redirected, but he was able to establish intermittent contact with military units that were investigating similar incidents at other airports. The information he was receiving confirmed that the Denver airport was just one part of a much larger operation. Elena's attack on the server room triggered alarms that alerted Sterling's people to the group's actual intentions. The surveillance network that had been monitoring their activities was suddenly blinded, but it was replaced by active countermeasures that were designed to eliminate the survivors before they could complete their mission. Automated weapon systems were activated throughout the airport, and the infected were being directed toward the control tower in coordinated waves. David's broadcasting equipment came online just as the control tower's defenses were being overwhelmed. The evidence that Marcus had prepared began transmitting to emergency frequencies across the region, but Sterling's people were using powerful jamming equipment to suppress the signal. David realized that maintaining the broadcast would require him to continuously adjust the transmission parameters to avoid the jamming, but this would leave him vulnerable to the attacks that were being directed at the control tower. Rebecca discovered that the aircraft in the maintenance facility had been prepared for Sterling's people to use as escape vehicles. The planes were fueled and equipped with supplies that would allow them to reach destinations outside the infected zones. The discovery revealed that Sterling's people had planned to eliminate the survivors and then escape to locations where they could continue their operations without interference. Marcus realized that their mission had evolved beyond simple survival or revenge. The evidence they were broadcasting could potentially prevent similar conspiracies from succeeding at other locations, but only if they could maintain the transmission long enough for it to reach people who could act on the information. The control tower was becoming increasingly difficult to defend, but abandoning it would mean abandoning their only chance to expose the truth. The group made a collective decision that would define their legacy. Instead of focusing on their own escape, they would prioritize completing the broadcast and ensuring that the evidence reached the right people. Elena would continue attacking the server room systems to prevent Sterling's people from stopping the transmission. David would maintain the broadcasting equipment even if it meant staying in the control tower during the final assault. Rebecca would attempt to destroy the escape aircraft to prevent Sterling's people from fleeing the region. Marcus would coordinate the operation and ensure that the evidence continued transmitting until the very end. The next phase of their mission would require them to sacrifice their own safety for the greater good, but they understood that their actions could prevent thousands of other innocent people from suffering the same fate they had endured. The final assault on the control tower began at sunset, when Sterling's people launched a coordinated attack using both automated systems and human operatives. Elena's sabotage of the server room had disrupted their surveillance capabilities, but it had also eliminated the group's ability to monitor their opponent's movements. The infected that had been wandering the airport randomly were now being directed by human controllers who understood the survivors' tactics and capabilities. David's broadcasting equipment was transmitting the evidence to emergency frequencies across 3 states, but Sterling's people were using mobile jamming units to suppress the signal in specific areas. The battle for control of the airwaves was as important as the physical battle for control of the airport, and David was fighting both campaigns simultaneously while under direct attack from automated weapon systems. Rebecca's assault on the aircraft maintenance facility had revealed that Sterling's people were preparing to eliminate all evidence of their conspiracy. The facility contained industrial equipment that was designed to destroy documents, hard drives, and other materials that could be used as evidence. Rebecca realized that preventing their escape was less important than preventing them from destroying the evidence that could expose similar conspiracies at other locations. Marcus continued coordinating the operation while preparing for the possibility that none of them would survive the night. His broadcasts to emergency responders were being answered by military units that were already investigating similar incidents, but the information he was providing was helping them understand the scope and nature of the conspiracy. The evidence that had seemed so important when they were trapped in the control tower was now being used to save lives at other locations. Elena's position in the server room became untenable when Sterling's people began using explosives to destroy the equipment she was attacking. The basement level was filling with smoke and debris, but she continued her mission to ensure that the surveillance network could not be restored. Her security training had taught her which systems were most critical to Sterling's operations, and she was systematically destroying the infrastructure that had made the conspiracy possible. David's broadcasting equipment was operating at maximum capacity, but the control tower's power supply was being deliberately overloaded by Sterling's people to damage the sensitive electronics. David was manually regulating the power flow while maintaining the broadcast frequency and defending against the automated attacks that were being directed at his position. His engineering expertise was the only thing preventing the equipment from failing completely. Rebecca discovered that the aircraft maintenance facility was being used as a command center for Sterling's operations across the region. The documents and communication equipment she found revealed the locations of other airports where similar conspiracies were being implemented. Rebecca realized that the information she was gathering could be as important as the evidence that Marcus was broadcasting from the control tower. Marcus's communication with emergency responders revealed that their mission was having an immediate impact. Military units were being dispatched to airports where similar incidents were occurring, and law enforcement agencies were beginning investigations into the conspiracy that had been exposed by the group's broadcasts. The evidence that had seemed so overwhelming when they were trapped was now being used to coordinate a response that could save thousands of lives. The control tower's defenses were failing, but the broadcasting equipment was still operational. David made a decision that would ensure the mission's success even if it meant his own death. He began overriding the safety systems that prevented the broadcasting equipment from operating at dangerous power levels. The increased signal strength would make it impossible for Sterling's people to jam the transmission, but it would also make the equipment unstable and potentially explosive. Elena's final assault on the server room systems eliminated Sterling's ability to coordinate with other conspiracy participants. The communication networks that had allowed the conspiracy to operate across multiple states were now offline, preventing Sterling's people from warning their associates about the military response that was being organized. Elena's sacrifice had effectively decapitated the conspiracy's command structure. Rebecca's discovery of the command center documents provided law enforcement with a complete list of conspiracy participants and their roles in the operation. The information she transmitted to emergency responders would allow them to arrest the surviving conspirators and prevent them from implementing similar operations at other locations. Rebecca's intelligence gathering had transformed a local incident into a national counterintelligence operation. Marcus's final broadcast included a complete summary of the conspiracy, the evidence that supported their conclusions, and the locations where similar operations were being conducted. His transmission was being received by emergency responders across the country, and the information was being used to coordinate the largest domestic counterintelligence operation in recent history. The control tower's final moments were marked by a series of explosions that destroyed the building's structural supports but left the broadcasting equipment operational. David's modifications had made the system independent of the building's power supply, and Marcus's final transmission continued even as the tower collapsed around them. The signal that had started as a desperate attempt at revenge had become a beacon that guided law enforcement to conspiracy participants across the country. Sterling's attempt to escape the airport was prevented by Rebecca's sabotage of the aircraft and Elena's destruction of the communication systems. The helicopter that was supposed to evacuate him was grounded by military units that had been alerted by Marcus's broadcasts. Sterling was captured along with documents and equipment that provided complete evidence of the conspiracy's scope and methods. The infected outbreak at Denver International Airport was contained within hours of the control tower's destruction, but the conspiracy that had been exposed continued to unravel for months. The evidence that Marcus and his team had gathered led to arrests at airports across the country and revealed a network of corrupt officials who had been using their positions to profit from disasters and eliminate witnesses to their crimes. Elena's body was found in the server room, surrounded by the destroyed equipment that had enabled the conspiracy. Her sacrifice had prevented Sterling's people from coordinating their response to the law enforcement operation, and her actions had saved the lives of hundreds of potential victims at other airports. The security protocols she had helped expose were replaced with systems that prioritized public safety over corporate profits. David's body was found in the control tower's ruins, still connected to the broadcasting equipment that had transmitted the evidence to emergency responders. His engineering expertise had made it possible to maintain the transmission under impossible conditions, and his modifications to the broadcasting system became the foundation for new emergency communication protocols that were implemented at airports nationwide. Rebecca's body was found in the aircraft maintenance facility, along with the documents and equipment she had been gathering when the final assault began. Her intelligence work had provided law enforcement with the information needed to arrest the surviving conspirators and prevent similar operations from being implemented at other locations. The evidence she had gathered led to the largest domestic counterintelligence operation in recent history. Marcus's body was found in the control tower's communication center, with his hands still on the broadcasting controls that had transmitted their evidence to the world. His final transmission had included a complete summary of the conspiracy and the evidence that supported their conclusions. His sacrifice had transformed a local incident of corruption into a national reckoning with the systems that had allowed such betrayals to occur. The investigation that followed revealed that Sterling's conspiracy had been operating for years, using natural disasters and emergency situations to eliminate witnesses and profit from the resulting chaos. The airports where similar operations had been planned were secured by military units, and the officials who had participated in the conspiracy were arrested and prosecuted. The evidence that Marcus's team had gathered became the foundation for new laws that prevented similar conspiracies from being implemented in the future. The infected outbreak was eventually contained, but the conspiracy that had been exposed led to fundamental changes in how emergency situations were handled at critical infrastructure locations. The automated systems that had been used to trap and eliminate the survivors were replaced with protocols that prioritized human oversight and public safety. The corporate interests that had profited from the conspiracy were held accountable for their actions, and their assets were used to compensate the families of the victims. The memorial that was built at the site of the Denver International Airport Control Tower honored not just Marcus, Elena, David, and Rebecca, but all the victims of the conspiracy that had been exposed by their sacrifice. Their actions had prevented thousands of other innocent people from suffering the same fate, and their legacy became a reminder that individuals could still make a difference when confronted with systematic corruption and abuse of power. The story of their resistance became a symbol of the importance of refusing to accept injustice, even when the odds seemed impossible. Their sacrifice had proven that truth and justice could prevail over corruption and conspiracy, but only when individuals were willing to risk everything to ensure that the truth was heard. Their legacy lived on in the systems and protocols that were implemented to prevent similar betrayals from occurring in the future.